I don't know, maybe you've heard the story of the priest who went to give a talk at a public school, and he couldn't find the office. So he asked one of the first graders, "Where's the office?" First grader pointed to where it was. And the first grader had never seen anyone dressed like this priest, and so he said, "What are you?" And the priest said, "Well, I'm a priest." And the kid said, "Well, what's a priest?" And the priest thought for a minute, and he said, "Well, a priest is somebody who helps people to get to heaven." And the kid said, "You can't even find your way to the office. How are you going to help anybody to get to heaven?" All right, so bioethics in light of Veritatis Splendor and Amoris Laetitia. So I suppose I should say a word about what those two things are, Veritatis Splendor and Amoris Laetitia. So, Veritatis Splendor, in English, The Splendor of Truth, was a 1993 work of Pope St. John Paul II regarding certain fundamental questions of the Church's moral teaching. So we are in the 25th anniversary year of Veritatis Splendor, 2018, which is part of the reason why we're bringing it into this conference. It's a wonderful document really on why some things are right and other things are wrong. Why some things lead us to true happiness and other things lead us away from it. Why some actions lead to our flourishing, why some actions work against our flourishing. That's what Veritatis Splendor was about, Pope St. John Paul II. Amoris Laetitia, which means the joy of love, is the much more recent document of Pope Francis, his apostolic exhortation on love in the family. Part of my reason for bringing these two things together in the same talk is that there are some people in the Church who would say that there is a conflict between these two documents. There are some people who would say that. My own position is that there is no conflict between these two documents. Veritatis Splendor talks about why some things are right, why other things are wrong, according to the Church and according to reason. Amoris Laetitia deals with, among other things, how to deal with people pastorally who are having a hard time living that teaching in regard to family life and married life. But I see no conflict between these two things. Hopefully I can make that more clear as we move along. So, I want to start out with some general points about Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis's recent document, his 2016 document. First of all, I would say there's a remarkable tone to this document. As you read it, you feel like you're sitting down with Pope Francis for a counseling session about family life. Now there's this footnote number 351. It's come to be known as the Smoking Footnote, because it has to do with divorced and remarried Catholics and communion with the sacraments. That Smoking Footnote, as it has been called, does not come until chapter 8. So I often like to ask people, have you read the first 7 chapters before getting to that footnote? In those chapters, Pope Francis quotes everyone from St. Paul to St. Thomas Aquinas to Martin Luther King to Babette's Feast. It has to be the first papal document in history to quote Babette's Feast, but it's in there. He gives advice on how to correct your children, advice on sex education, even advice on how to live with your in-laws. It's all there in Amoris Laetitia. And I would say that if everyone lived the first 7 chapters of the document, then the whole question of divorce and remarriage and what comes after that would be much less of an issue in the first place. So I really encourage you, if you haven't read the document, the easiest thing to do is just to go to vatican.va. It's the Vatican's website. You can find all the documents there. It's a wonderful document to read. Now, as I started to realize when this document first came out, that people were kind of going straight to this footnote. And as a moral theology teacher, very often I'd bump into people, and as soon as they found out I was a moral theology teacher, the next thing out of their mouth would be, "What do you think of chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia?" I want to give a sampling of Pope Francis's wisdom in Amoris Laetitia. I'm just going to give you a few quotes to give you a little bit of the flavor of everything that comes before chapter 8. So Pope Francis says, "We treat effective relationships the way we treat material objects and the environment. Everything is disposable, everyone uses and throws away, takes and breaks, exploits and squeezes to the last drop, then goodbye." This is a very common theme in Pope Francis's teaching. The very same mentality that says we throw away unborn children when they're inconvenient, we throw away things and trash the environment, we also throw away relationships. You know, this relationship isn't working anymore, I'm going to throw it away and get a new one. And Pope Francis laments that kind of mentality in relationships. He also says in Amoris Laetitia, "We have to realize that all of us are a complex mixture of light and shadows. The other person is much more than the sum of the little things that annoy me." Isn't that great? You know, this can happen in marriage, it can happen in family life, it can happen in religious life, where we start to look at other people as the sum of the things that annoy me. Pope Francis is reminding us that the other person is much, much more than that. He says, in regard to like the dreamlike vision that a lot of people have of the perfect relationship, it is not helpful to dream of an idyllic and perfect love needing no stimulus to grow. A celestial notion of earthly love forgets that the best is yet to come, that fine wine matures with age. Wouldn't it be great if we all looked at marriage that way, if we all looked at priesthood that way? It's like a fine wine that matures with age. Now, as I mentioned before, a lot of people skipped all of this and went right to the footnote. It's very interesting that Cardinal Schönborn of Vienna predicted that that is exactly what would happen on April 8th, 2016, when Amoris Laetitia was released. So look at what Cardinal Schönborn said. He said, "I should, however, mention that Pope Francis has described chapters 4 and 5 of Amoris Laetitia as central, not only in terms of their position, but also their content. We cannot encourage a path of fidelity and mutual self-giving without encouraging the growth, strengthening, and deepening of conjugal and family love. These two central chapters of Amoris Laetitia will probably be skipped by many people keen to arrive at the so-called hot potatoes, the critical points." And in fact, in Amoris Laetitia itself, Pope Francis basically says, take your time with this document. He says, given the rich fruits of the 2-year synod process, this exhortation will treat in different ways a wide variety of questions. This explains its inevitable length. Consequently, I do not recommend a rushed reading of the text. Pope Francis saying, take your time with this document. Cardinal O'Malley of Boston said much the same thing. Rather than try to draw immediate conclusions from the text, we are urged to reflect upon it and to ponder patiently and carefully what the teachings will mean for the Church and for her ministry to families. So, when the document came out in April of 2016, I had quite a few of my students coming to me, asking me, what do you think of it? Well, I quoted Pope Francis, and I quoted Cardinal O'Malley, and I told them, I'm not going to say anything about it until I've read it 3 times. It was very good because it was already April, so that got me through to the end of the school year. Then over the summer, I read it 3 times. When I came back in the fall, I had to start saying something about the more controversial parts of Amoris Laetitia. Now, to enter into this, I'm going to start with a quote from Veritatis Splendor, Pope St. John Paul II's document of 25 years ago. This is a wonderful quote that says something very important about the Church's overall moral vision, the Church's vision of the moral life. Let's look at this key quote from Pope St. John Paul II. He says, by submitting to the common law here means God's law as it is revealed through the Church and through our human reason, our acts build up the true communion of persons and by God's grace practice charity, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. When, on the contrary, we disregard the law, or even are merely ignorant of it, whether culpably or not, our acts damage the communion of persons to the detriment of each. Okay, so the church would say that if I disregard God's law, or even if I'm just ignorant of it, even if I'm ignorant not through my own fault, and I go ahead and do things that violate God's law, my acts are still going to damage myself and other people. I think we all know that this is true on some level. I was thinking the other day of everything that's happened with the concussion controversy in football and even in soccer. You know, for years and years, for decades, people didn't really know that that kind of contact could cause concussions, and that people would be having such trouble later on in life because of those concussions. So they were ignorant of that, and yet they were still being hurt by it, weren't they? Even though they were ignorant, what they were doing was still hurting them. And the church would say that this is very true of the church's moral teaching as well. Take something like abortion. Even if a person does not know that there is anything wrong with it, and even if they don't know, let's just say for the sake of their argument, that it's not their fault that they don't know, they are still going to be hurt by it if they do it. The child ends up just as dead. The mother still ends up being the mother of a dead child. The abortion hurts other people and it hurts society, even if they are ignorant of the church's teaching. Okay? It's a very, very important principle in the church's teaching, that what you don't know can hurt you. Ignorance is not bliss. When we violate God's law, even unknowingly, we do things that are hurtful to ourselves and hurtful to other people. So I like to illustrate this with a picture. I showed a picture very much like this last year. Here you are on the path of life, trying to get to your final goal, which is heaven. Just like that priest said to that first grader. Hopefully priests are helping you to get to heaven, right? And the church is going to teach that there are some kinds of actions that fall short of the happiness, of the perfection, of the flourishing that we are called to, simply because of the kind of action that they are, right? So murder, for example, and suicide, they violate a very basic human good of human life. Adultery, for example, violates the good of marriage and family life. Slander violates the good of human communication, okay? So even if this person doesn't realize that these things are wrong, by doing them, they still hurt themselves and they hurt other people. It becomes harder for them to get here, which is where we all want to get in the end. Okay? So, this is what Pope John Paul II is saying when he says, when we disregard the law or even are merely ignorant of it, whether culpably or not, our acts damage the communion of persons to the detriment of each. Now, if you notice on that picture, one of the things that's here under evil actions is adultery. The church has always taught that that is evil. The church still teaches that it's evil. The church will always teach that that is evil. And so, for example, if you have a validly married couple, and if they divorce, and if one of them gets married to someone else, let's say in the presence of a justice of the peace in the state of Massachusetts, the church would say that they are now in a state of adultery. And that teaching goes back to the original teaching of Jesus in Luke 16. Jesus said, "Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and the one who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery." Okay, so this is the original teaching of Jesus. And so the question has always come up, especially to us priests who are working, let's say, in parishes. If you have a divorced and remarried couple, how do you deal with them pastorally? How do you get them involved in the life of the church? Can they confess? Can they go to communion? Etc. And John Paul II, way back in the 1980s, gave a very clear answer to that kind of question. And this is what he said. Reconciliation, and he's talking about divorced and remarried Catholics here, reconciliation in the sacrament of penance, which would open the way to the Eucharist, can only be granted to those who, repenting of having broken the sign of the covenant and of fidelity to Christ, are sincerely ready to undertake a way of life that is no longer in contradiction to the indissolubility of marriage. Pope John Paul II says, this means in practice that when, for serious reasons, such as, for example, the children's upbringing, a man and a woman cannot satisfy the obligation to separate, they take on themselves the duty to live in complete continence, that is, by abstinence from the acts proper to married couples. So, Pope St. John Paul II is saying, back in the 1980s, that if you have a validly married couple, if they divorce, and if one of them remarries, there's only two ways that that person can receive communion. One way is if they separate from their new, let's say, civilly married spouse. The other way is if they can't separate, they need to live in complete continence. In other words, they need to commit themselves to living as brother and sister rather than as husband and wife. Okay? I hope that's clear. And that was very clear teaching of Pope St. John Paul II. And I will say that when I was a priest in a parish, I had a very small number of couples who were willing to commit themselves to this. In other words, they had divorced, they had remarried outside of the church. For one reason or another, they did not or could not get an annulment, and they committed themselves to living as brother and sister until such a time that as their marital situation could be resolved. Okay? Hopefully that's clear. If it's not clear, then please, you can write down a question and we can deal with it later. Now, Pope Francis in Amoris Laetitia says this. Because of forms of conditioning and mitigating factors, it is possible that in an objective situation of sin, which may not be subjectively culpable, in other words, blameworthy, or fully such, a person can be living in God's grace, can love, and can also grow in the life of grace and charity while receiving the Church's help to this end. And then he footnotes down here, this is what he says in the footnote, in certain cases, this can include the help of the sacraments. I would also point out that the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak. And so what does this mean? This is what a lot of people were coming up to me and asking me about, especially in 2016. What does this mean exactly? Well, I would say that one of the things that Pope Francis is calling attention to is a very clear teaching of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, CCC. This is an ancient teaching of the Church that in order for mortal sin to be present, there has to be three things. First of all, it has to be something that is seriously wrong. A person has to do an action that's seriously wrong. They have to have full knowledge that it's wrong, and they have to have deliberate consent. Those are the traditional three things that need to be there in order for a person to be in mortal sin. And so Pope Francis is saying that it's possible to be in an objective situation of sin, where there is something gravely evil, and yet the person could be living in God's grace, perhaps because they lack sufficient knowledge or they lack deliberate consent. So he goes on in Amoris Laetitia and says, for an adequate understanding of the possibility and need of special discernment in certain irregular situations, and here he's talking about irregular marital situations, one thing must always be taken into account, lest anyone think that the demands of the gospel are in any way being compromised. The Church possesses a solid body of reflection concerning mitigating factors and situations. Hence, Pope Francis says, it can no longer simply be said that all those in any irregular situation are living in a state of mortal sin and are deprived of sanctifying grace. Now, when you read this, and you see it can no longer simply be said, that kind of suggests that Pope Francis has a change in mind, doesn't it? If you're saying it can no longer be said that people in any irregular situation are living in a state of mortal sin. Pope Francis goes on, because a lot of people then at this point want to know, well, which divorced and remarried people are you talking about? Which ones perhaps can receive communion now who couldn't receive communion before? This is what he says. If we consider the immense variety of concrete situations, such as those I have mentioned, it is understandable that neither the Synod nor this exhortation could be expected to provide a new set of general rules, canonical in nature and applicable to all cases. What is possible is simply a renewed encouragement to undertake a responsible, personal, and pastoral discernment of particular cases. In other words, Pope Francis is saying, rather clearly in Amoris Laetitia, I am not going to give you specific guidelines about this. What I'm calling for, he's saying, is a renewed encouragement to undertake a responsible, personal, and pastoral discernment of particular cases. Right? Now, this distresses a lot of people, because especially in pastoral situations, you want clear guidelines, right? You want guidelines to be clear as possible. But Pope Francis says, again in Amoris Laetitia, by thinking that everything is black and white, we sometimes close off the way of grace and of growth and discourage paths of sanctification which give glory to God. So I would say this, Pope Francis is not black or white. I would not say that he's gray. I would say that he's colorful. You know, he's Argentinian. It's going to be hard to tie him down the way you could kind of tie down his two predecessors. So, what you then had were various bishops, various groups of bishops interpreting Amoris Laetitia and giving pastoral guidelines to the priests in their parishes. One such group were the bishops of Buenos Aires, Argentina. So they came out with a document called Basic Criteria for the Application of Amoris Laetitia. This was a little bit later in 2016. And this is what they said in that document. When the concrete circumstances of a couple make it feasible, especially when both are Christians with a walk of faith, by the way, this is my translation from the original Spanish, the determination to live in continence can be proposed, right? Just the way John Paul II said. They're saying the determination to live as brother and sister can be proposed. Amoris Laetitia does not ignore the difficulties of this option and leaves open the possibility of approaching the sacrament of reconciliation when one fails in this resolution. This, again, is nothing new. Even John Paul II, back in the 1980s, would say that if a couple commits themselves to living as brother and sister, and let's say they fall once, they fall into sin once, they could certainly confess, rededicate themselves to living as brother and sister, and move on. All right? So far, there's nothing different here in what the Buenos Aires bishops have said. Here comes a big however from their document. They go on and say, in other more complicated circumstances, and when a declaration of nullity could not be obtained, when there's some reason why an annulment cannot be obtained for some reason, the option mentioned of living as brother and sister may not be feasible. However, a road of discernment is equally possible. If one comes to know that in a concrete case there are limitations that mitigate responsibility and culpability, particularly when a person considers that they would fall into another fault harming the children of the new union, Amoris Laetitia opens the possibility of access to the sacraments of reconciliation and the Eucharist. These, in turn, dispose the person to continue maturing and growing with the strength of grace. So here we have the Buenos Aires bishops, I would say, clearly going beyond what John Paul II said in the 1980s, because they envision a situation where a couple cannot get an annulment. For some reason, they feel that they cannot commit themselves to living as brother and sister, and yet they are saying, at least in some cases, these people might still be able to go to the sacrament of reconciliation and receive the Eucharist. The Buenos Aires bishops sent this document to Pope Francis for him to look at it. Pope Francis read it, and he sent a letter back to the Buenos Aires bishops. And this is what he said. I received the document of the Pastoral Region of Buenos Aires, Criterios Básicos para la Aplicación del Capítulo 8 de Amoris Laetitia. Thank you very much for having sent it to me, and I congratulate you for the work you have undertaken, a true example of the accompaniment of priests. The document is very good and explains exactly the sense of Chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. There are no other interpretations, Pope Francis says, and I am sure that it will do much good. May the Lord repay you for this effort of pastoral charity. So the Pope clearly agreeing with what the Buenos Aires bishops said in their document, thanking them for it, and Pope Francis also asked, and this has happened, that both the document of the Buenos Aires bishops and his response would be placed in the Acta Apostolica Sedis, which is the official record of Vatican documents. Okay? So, now I'm going to summarize and hopefully say a few things that are clear. If you're a little confused at this point, hopefully this will clarify things. First of all, I would say read the whole thing, not just the controversial part, because it is a wonderful document. I would say, it's clear at this point, the door is open for more divorced and remarried couples to receive communion, though it is not entirely clear to whom. The theological justification for such couples to receive communion is that they may be in an objective situation of adultery without being guilty of mortal sin. The decision to receive communion should only be made within a process of pastoral accompaniment by a priest, and this is a quote from Amoris Laetitia, according to the teaching of the Church and the guidelines of the bishop. In other words, Pope Francis does not want married couples deciding on their own that they can go to communion if they've been divorced and remarried. He doesn't want priests just acting like a loose cannon, saying you can go to communion even though you're divorced and remarried. He says, according to the teachings of the Church and the guidelines of the bishop. Now, of course, we've had different bishops and different groups of bishops saying slightly different things. And so here's my kind of summary question. Given the absence of precise guidelines from Pope Francis and the diverse responses of bishops, are we dealing with a decentralization of the decision about who can receive communion? That's kind of what I'm thinking at this point, that Pope Francis's mindset may be sort of a decentralization to the local diocese, to the local bishops, in regard to who can receive communion. Now, many people are very uncomfortable with that. I had a very bright student in class raise his hand once when I said this, and he said, "What's the difference between decentralization and relativism?" It's a great question, isn't it? Are we saying that something is a mortal sin in one diocese and not a mortal sin in another diocese, right? Here's the point I would make. I would say that relativism is the danger of decentralization, but decentralization can also save you from relativism. And here's what I mean by that. I was stationed in the Philippines for 9 years. And I have to say that in 9 years in the Philippines, I did not meet a single person who had gotten an annulment. They just do it much less over there. I'm not sure why. I think part of it has to do with the fact that it's a third world country. I mean, bishops are occupied just with keeping their people alive, giving them basic pastoral care, trying to feed a country that's having a hard time feeding itself, right? Also, if you're going to get an annulment, the original spouse has to be contacted. I've traveled around the Philippines. There's over 7,000 islands in the Philippines. Can you imagine trying to contact the original spouse? Sometimes very, very, very difficult. So let's suppose I run into somebody in one of the provinces in the Philippines. They start talking to me about their marital situation, and it becomes very clear to me that if they were living in Boston, they could probably get an annulment within 6 months. Okay? Perhaps a sort of decentralization of who can receive communion will allow the same person who could receive communion in Boston after getting an annulment to receive communion in the Philippines even if they can't get an annulment. Okay? That's kind of what I'm thinking. I put that out there ready to be corrected if Pope Francis or some higher authority should correct me, but I kind of wonder if maybe we're dealing with a decentralization of the decision about who can receive communion. So, to bring this home now to our conference, what difference does Amoris Laetitia make for the Church's moral teaching in general, including bioethics? Because there are some people out there saying that this is some kind of alternative moral viewpoint, and maybe Veritatis Splendor doesn't apply anymore. Well, I would say Amoris Laetitia does not make much of a difference at all in regard to the Church's moral teaching in general, including bioethics. Amoris Laetitia has to do, among other things, with how to deal with people who are having a hard time living up to that teaching. It does not change the teaching itself, right? So I would say that the vision of Veritatis Splendor still holds. That has not changed. So adultery is still here. It's still an evil action. It's still wrong, okay? I think Pope Francis emphasizes, what he's emphasizing is the need for us to walk with people who are not living in accordance with the Church's teaching. And part of that accompaniment involves teaching them the whole truth about right and wrong, the whole truth about marriage and family life, teaching them that truth which is for their own benefit. Because if they are ignorant of it, they are ignorant of it to their own peril. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears. This picture was taken with my flip phone. So before I shift gears and deal with a particular bioethical issue in order to kind of exemplify this, I'm wondering, maybe we could just stretch for a minute or something, okay? Just don't go anywhere. Maybe you can just stretch for a minute before we shift gears, okay?